Okay, hello everyone, online and offline here in the room. Welcome to this event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gangl. I am the center's coordinator and I will also be today's moderator. Today's speaker is Taynna Marino, to my right, with the topic Empathy, Intergenerational Justice and the Ethics of History. Taynna is a PhD candidate at Mickiewicz University in Poznan, Poland. And I think she does her PhD on empathy in historical theory. You can correct me later if that's not correct. Taynna's main research interests lie in the epistemic and ethical limits of anthropocentrism, indigenous knowledges, animal studies, and environmental ethics. Now, Taynna's most recent publications include the role of empathy in bridging indigenous and Western knowledges, Dominic Lacapra and Ailton Krenak, I hope I pronounced that correctly, which was published in 2022 in Rethinking History, and an edited volume called History Beyond Human in Portuguese, which collects essays by Eva Domanska, which Taynna, I think, co-edited and co-translated with somebody else. Also, Taynna conducted a set of interviews with leading scholars in theory of history on occasion of a big conference in Poznan, and those interviews were published on the webpage of History and Theory at the end of 2023. So I invite all of you to check out her most recent papers and also this series of interviews. Now, this event is outside of our spring seminar schedule. After today, our spring seminar will continue on May 28th, where we have one more session. And on May 28th, we will have Seth Guidoan from the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa in Italy, speaking about in between Hegel and Marx, Gramsci's Storicismo Assoluto, in brackets, absolute historicism. This event will also take place in hybrid format, so in this room or a room very much like this, and on Zoom. And this is so because Seth Guidoan, just like Taynna at the moment, will be a visiting scholar with us at the Center for Philosophical Studies of History in the end of May. Now, if you want to stay updated about all our events and activities, please consider following our social media. We have Facebook and X, formerly Twitter. If you want to become a visiting scholar just like Taynna is, and the Seth Guidoan will be, please check our homepage, all the information is there. And finally, if you want to speak in our seminar, again, in a setting very much like this, please contact us. We are currently have begun planning our autumn seminar, but there are still some open slots for autumn, and we're happy to accommodate if you want. Now, just to very sure the technicalities, as I said, I have already forcibly muted online because we have a big speaker here in the middle of the room to avoid any disturbance, but worry not. I will liberate everybody in the beginning of the discussion session, and you can talk freely then. We will have a discussion session after Taynna's talk, which I think will take around 45 minutes. That I will moderate in the discussion session, and we will alternate between the room and online. And especially for the online folk, if you have any question, comments, concern, please first indicate so in the chat. I will make a speakers list. When it's your turn, you can either speak up with or without your camera on, or you can write your question in the chat and I'll read it out loud. That was it from me already. Thank you, Taynna, for accepting our invitation. Let me just share your presentation. Your screen. Right. Yes. Floor is yours. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for having me here. I think especially Georg for the introduction, and your Mate, and everybody who came here to attend and participate in the discussions. Today, I'm going to present something that is a work in progress now. It is the first effort, actually the first presentation I'm giving on the topic. And I have been exploring this topic for the last months, I'd say, and then I would like to show you how this topic that I'm going to present today is related to the overall of my PhD dissertation. Okay, so first, my provisional title is Empathy Beyond Anthropocentrism and Eurocentrism in Contemporary Historical Theory. Okay.
Enough?
Very good. Excellent.
Sorry.
So this is the title of my PhD dissertation so far. And I already wrote 2 chapters, one about transcultural empathy that I published as an article in Rethinking History, that I was discussing like the limits of empathy as the limits of the Eurocentrism in empathy, and trying to bridge, to use empathy as a bridging concept between indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge. So the paper was the role of empathy in bridging Western indigenous knowledge, something like that. And then I wrote another paper about transspecies empathy. So in this paper, I was discussing more the idea of empathy concern the limits of anthropocentrism in history. I forgot to say, all my background is in theory of history. I always study history, not philosophy of history, but I consider myself doing something like a theory of history or philosophy of history. And then this paper was not published yet, but it's a paper that is ready to be published. And then this is the 3rd chapter of my PhD dissertation so far, in which I'm exploring the notion of empathy and the idea or the concept of intergenerational justice or intergenerational ethics, which is a philosophical concept. You can find, for example, definitions and the state of art of discussion if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And then the main questions that I'm addressing in this paper is, first of all, what is the role of empathy, if any, in the discussions on intergenerational justice in the ethics of history? So I want to basically know if empathy plays a role in the ethics of history, how historians still interact with the past, and in the claims for justice or responding to past and future justices. But I will explore this later on. And then the second question is, should historians empathize? It's a very broad, general question, but I think this question is the main question actually that I'm addressing in this paper, and also with whom and for what should historians empathize? I forgot to say something. No, don't think so. Okay, so this is basically the main idea of my thesis so far. I'm the 4th year of my PhD. And then, okay, next. In this presentation, I want to discuss the relations between empathy and historians' responsibility in addressing past and future injustices. So first, I will discuss what is the notion of intergenerational justice. Second, I will discuss this ethical political turn in history and its implications for the production of historical knowledge. And then I will try to address empathy as a kind of ethical imperative and understand the limits and the possibilities of empathy understood as such. So some of the questions that I'm trying to answer, and some of them I will not fully answer in this presentation, but they are guiding me in these endeavors. And they are, should historians empathize in order to be more ethically responsible? Or can empathy stand in the way of justice and produce even more epistemic gaps? And then the other question is, what are the limits and possibilities for empathy as an ethical imperative? So I just introduced, sorry, I forgot to put my title. So now I'm going to discuss about intergenerational justice. Intergenerational justice is a philosophical concept that tells us about the relations between time and justice. And this idea arises both moral and ethical concerns about what moral agents have to do, what moral agents have to do, and what moral agents can or should do. So it's both related to the normative sense, the duties and the obligations that should be addressed towards the past and the future, and also in terms of values, virtues, practices, and the art of living in a moral community. So I'm interested in both decisions, moral and ethical ones. Okay, so there is a definition, for example, by Axel Gossery, I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly, but he defines intergenerational justice as something that is not only about injustice or justice between generations, as the proper name seems to be related. But intergenerational justice is about injustice between individuals, and I also would add groups from different generations. So it's more like justice related to people from different times, different temporalities, than just people from different generations. So I think the concept is a bit imprecise in the definition, but I think it's also a concept that many people are using nowadays to talk about injustice from people victims of traumatic events, traumatic limit events, and then also to address responsibilities to the future. So the main discussions occurring nowadays is about how intergenerational justice can guide us to discussions about climate change, the finitude of humanity and the planet, and so on and so forth. Okay. And this book was published last year, so it means the discussion is going on like recently. And then I would like to jump a little bit to the discussions about the limits of narrativism and the ethical political turn in history. I wanted to understand how this context of genocides, wars, violence, catastrophes, ecological catastrophes, and so on, from the 20th century, 21st century, allow us to think about the demands of our times and how historians, theorists, and philosophers of history, in some ways, are trying to address, or at least considering their demands in our time that should or should not be addressed, but there are demands, that these words, demand, they are around these discussions, and then the ethical political, and then Yuri-Matti Kukkonen, Kalle Pihlainen have been talking about these limits of narrativism, the notion of post-narrativism, or the materiality of the past. And in the same direction, Dominique Lacapra, Berbe Belvenage, Marcelo Rangel, Valdeir Lopes de Araújo, they are also talking about how in any attempt to write or to produce a discourse, a historical discourse, we have some ethical and political considerations that one should be aware, even though, I mean, we can avoid discussing about this, but I think it's something that is inevitably part of the way we make sense of the past. So it's not unavoidable to discuss about these ethical and political considerations, in my opinion. So producing historical knowledge is not just a matter of imploding facts in a logical sense that follows rigorous procedures and methodologies that aim to achieve historical truth, even though it's not the truth, but it's a certain truth. It still is not just enough to write in this way, but also discuss these implications. And for example, Hayden White, in his posthumous book, published in 2022, he also talks a bit about the ethical and political considerations, practices in historical work. And he said, for example, that to be, act, or think ethically or politically can be considered to be either good or bad, depending on how one views ethics and politics. So I think it's something that is also very controversial when we talk about these ethical and political demands. What kind of ethical, what kind of political demands is also, the concepts are very broad in this sense. But it's also interesting to acknowledge them because, as Hayden White says, on principle, historical knowledge sever neither the ethically good nor the political useful. But in practice, the great historians vacillate between these two ideals. So I would say that they are ideals that we have to explore more, how they are taking places in our historical discourse and how, in the way we make sense of the past, following Hayden White. And Judith Butler also, in the foreword to Hayden White's book, explores how this question of what to do is a very important question, even though the idea of Hayden White was not to answer the question what we should do, what to do, what to do, but to reflect on the conditions of the historical conditions that give rise to this question, and how this question orients ourselves to the action, to real action, regardless of what kind of action it is. But we assume that is an ethical political action. And then Butler also says that one requires neither realism nor a clear form of embodiment in order to convey an ethical political orientation and to be involved in a practical and ethical dilemma. I'm going so too fast, or it's okay?
It's good.
Okay. Oh. And then my own understanding of this discussion, in a simple way, I would say that ethics is a set of values one may carry in their historical practice. And politics, for me, is the way one positions oneself in time and space. So how we acknowledge our own situateness. In this sense, ethical and political implications of historians are manifested in their engagements with the past and the acknowledgement of their own situateness and responsibility towards the notion of the possible. In the sense, I understand that historical knowledge, at least in 21st century, not all historical knowledge, but I would say that I defend that historical knowledge is future-oriented, because we are trying to find a way. I mean, when discussing about intergenerational justice, the idea is not only to come back to the past, but also to orient or to guide somehow the future to the possible past that could be, and the possible future as well that may be. And then I think the main questions here for me when addressing empathy is discussing the engagements with the past, so how these engagements take place, and the acknowledgement of their situateness and responsibility. So this is the two main things when I'm talking about empathy. So now I will bring some definitions of empathy, because I'm just like saying many things about empathy without contextualizing. But first, before that, I would say that the question of historical engagement is also very controversial. On the one hand, we have many historians that are skeptical about this idea of engagement with the experience of victims, and the idea that this can maximize the overall well-being. This idea of eudaimonia as well, like how this kind of values, virtues can bring this eudaimonia status. And also how they are also skeptical about how engagement can provide, can foster respect for other cultures or avoid extreme violent events to happen again. And this is a very important criticism that we have to acknowledge. And other historians are also talking about how this possibility of engagements can or cannot serve to justice, and instead of serving to justice, create more and more this idea of judgment of history. So this is also something risky about the engagements we have with the past. And Bevenage, for example, he's discussing how the concepts of reconciliation and peace and stability can be like misrepresented somehow. I mean, how these concepts are not actually concepts. How these concepts like reconciliation, they also are like controversial concepts. What do you mean by reconciliation and how to address it? Because sometimes the conflicts are so big, there are some kind of dichotomies that we cannot actually bridge. So how we can bring reconciliation? So it's also a question. And on the other hand, there are also some historians that are engaging with the historians about historians' engagement with the past in terms of virtues, skills, or habits, practice that we should think about and systematize to our historical practice, or at least bring some hope for the future. So some of them are Eva Domońska, Herman Pohl, and João O'Hara. They're addressing these problems in this direction. And as I see, reflecting on historians' engagement with the past is a way of addressing a specific mode of responsibility. So when I talk about responsibility, of course, I understand there are many different ways of being responsible to something or to the past. And I think that there is a specific mode of responsibility that is present in historians' engagement with the past. And that's why I think that empathy is important to address this specific mode of responsibility. How historians and theorists and philosophers are agents in history. So I'm dialoguing with many of these authors that bring some different definitions of empathy among them. So, for example, there is Tysorex, who has a book on empathy and history, historic understanding, reenactment, hermeneutics, and education. He's discussing more like the concept of historical empathy for education, and also in dialogue with hermeneutics and colonialism. And then we have like Karsten Stilber, rediscovering empathy. He's a philosopher working with this notion of empathy, and he has some two definitions of empathy. One is the basic empathy, and the other is reenactive empathy, which is some kind of higher level of empathy. There is also this volume edited by Vanessa Lux and Sigrid Weigel, who are addressing this problem of empathy through different disciplines. So it's a very transdisciplinary book. You have like discussions from philosophy, hermeneutics, psychology, neuroscience, and many other fields. There is also Dominique Lacapra, which I think is one of my favorites because he has many books about empathy, and he's not actually recognized as a theorist of empathy, but he has plenty of books about it. And this is the last one, Understanding Others, Peoples, Animals, Passes. Then he discusses the relation between how we understand people from the past, but also animals. So he has a discussion about the limits of anthropocentrism in history as well. And I'm also very interested with his definitions of empathy. I will bring another a definition in the next slide. And also Thomas Kohut, which has who has a book, Empathy in the Historical Understanding of the Human Past. I think this book is very important because it systematizes the discussion of empathy in historiography. So he's like bringing many definitions of how empathy how empathy is defined and used in different disciplines in humanities, but bringing like a focus on how historians understand empathy. And he is the son of Heinz Kohut, who was also a researcher on the topic of empathy. And then he also gives some examples, like concrete examples in historical knowledge from historical events of how empathy can be used to understand people from the past. But basically, in his book, he's addressing more epistemological discussions. And here in this presentation, I want to not to criticize the book or counteract the book anyway, but I want to go a little bit beyond of the discussions of epistemology to understand how empathy is also part of the discussion of epistemology, but it's something else, can offer something else if we discuss in this sense. And then I have some short definitions of empathy. I just bring 3 of them. And there is also the book by Martha Nussbaum, Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. And she has a very humanist approach to empathy. And then Lacapre's definition basically is that empathy is an imaginative, intellectual, and emotional rapport with the other as other that does not imply an ability to take the place or speak for the other. It might rather be understood as putting oneself in the other's position without taking the other's place, a distinction that recognizes difference. So I really like his definition. I think that Lacapre he catches these main ideas of empathy as something that is not only and exclusively emotional, as many people may think about it, but it's also something about the way we think, the way we imagine. So it has both cognitive and emotional dimensions. And I also would say that this intellectual dimension of empathy is not cognitive per se. I mean, it is both emotional and cognitive. So I think empathy can bring these 2 sides together without actually you needed to divide between what is just emotion or just reason. So I think empathy is very interesting in this way for bringing bridging the discussion, and also the discussion about how historians speak for the others, like from a privileged position or something related to like historians are doing good because they are speaking for the others of the past. This is very controversial, actually. And then I see that Lacapre is bringing this to the discussion, how putting ourselves in the other's place is not about taking the other's place, just about recognizing our own situatedness and trying to approximate, like to recognize the distance and the closeness between oneself and the other. I also like Kohut's definition. Kohut has the definition of empathy as a way to know and understand the people of the past historically. And this is a very important definition, but I also think that it should be addressed also in this ethical or pro-social behavior as well. Like historians as agents in history, not only as just as knowers of the past. And I think that Nussbaum also brings a very interesting idea. Empathy as a capacity for positional thinking, which is much related to Dominique Lacapre's definition. This idea to see the world from another creature's viewpoint. I mean, it's not actually this. I don't agree with her in this part of the sentence, but I really like this notion of positional thinking, how we position ourselves in our own world and in relation to the other when thinking, when producing knowledge. And this also is not necessary for sympathy. Sympathy, I think she's addressing sympathy as the notion of helping behavior, or maybe the notion that sympathy somehow imply idea of liking, like this idea of sympathizing with something. But sympathy is also a very polysemic concept. So we have like different origins from moral philosophy to psychology, and then we actually is more deep than this. But I like when she addresses the idea of positional thinking as something that can be correlated to helping behavior or not. Okay, so just to summarize, there are some epistemological reasons and ethical reasons how empathy is not very much liked by historians in general. So I think these epistemological reasons are because empathy is very imprecise, is a very polysemic concept, so we have many controversial definitions across time and across disciplines. And most of the times, historians think that empathy has this connotation of feeling, something that is gender feminine, or like something that is soft, or that empathy is related to forgiveness, in relation to traumatic events, which is very complex, and also related to sympathy or love for the people of the past. And this is, to summarize these discussions, are mostly addressed by historians and theorists, philosophers of history that understand that empirical, rationalistic, and objective science cannot possess this kind of ability or skill or practice. It doesn't have a place in this kind of environment. So do historians need to empathize in order to better understand the past is one question that many people are addressing. Thomas Kohut, Dominique Lacapra, and others. And there are some ethical problems about empathy that are just being discussed more with people from memory studies, and they are saying that empathy when empathy doesn't involve critical and self-reflective thinking, it may arise many problems, many dangers. For example, one's own situatedness as bystanders, beneficiaries, and participants of oppressive practices. And when empathy inhibits effective political actions, as statecrafts have been discussing. I don't know how to pronounce his name, he's Dutch, so probably something like that.
Statecrafts.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the question is, do historians need to empathize in order to be responsive and responsible to the past? This interests me a lot, how to understand if empathy requires effective political actions or not, or it's only about the motivation behind historians' practice, or if it's something that should be addressed like an effective political action. We can also overcome a little bit what is often understood as what is doing history, right? But I think that the question about critical and self-reflective thinking is something that can be further discussed in the ethical considerations of empathy. And then the difference between being responsible and responsive, even though they are like similar, being responsible to something does not necessarily implies that someone is going to be responsive, right? So responsiveness is the ability to respond to something. And then I think that addressing these effective political actions is more like responding to the past, not only being responsible to the past. And of course, it implies like bigger questions about what's actually the historian's responsibility. And there are many controversies about it. But anyway, I'm trying to bring my own ideas on the topic in the short presentation. And for example, according to Vishai Margalit, he says that humans' relations are manifested in actions, or rather in interactions. They are guided by reasons. So I think that as this kind of relations, empathic relations are also this kind of interactions that presuppose not only the action of the historian, but also the way, the other way around. So what is the action of the past? It's something that we should discuss. And the idea that empathy is also a kind of is a mode of responsibility that is also guided by reasons. So what reasons we have to empathize? I'm not saying reasons in an only cognitive sense, but reasons. What are why we should empathize, if we should? And then Margalit has these two types of human relations that he is discussing, the thick ones and the thin ones. And he says that thick relations are granted and attributed such as parent, friend, lover, fellow countryman, and so on and so forth. So it is kind of close relations we have with people that we know, that we share something in common, while thin relations are something that is more abstract, is something related to being human, for example, or being a living being, or something like that. And then this kind of thin relations, they are more difficult to maintain. And then I think that we need empathy for the second case, because this first case we don't need actually empathy, but for thin relations we need empathy. That's why I divide into different kinds of empathy that I provisionally call intuitive empathy, intentional empathy. Maybe I would change this, but I think they address what I'm trying to say now. Intuitive empathy is that this empathy that we don't think about it. We just empathize in a natural sense. We don't actually, maybe we're not actually conscious about the way that we relate to people who are closer to us. And that's why this intuitive empathy is more concerned about morality than about ethics. While intentional empathy is a kind of conscious empathy, something that is guided by reason, something that is more like we are intentionally empathize because we aim at something. And then I understand that this intentional empathy can help us to overcome our natural natural indifference to distant others. So, like Margalit is saying, caring is a demanding attitude towards others. And then in this case, he's addressing caring not as something related to love but it's not about liking, but it's about paying attention. It's about minding. So I think we need empathy towards people we do not care, we do not mind. So that's why I understand this intentional empathy as something that needs to be further discussed and elaborated as a kind of value or virtue or practice or method. I mean, we can call it with different names, but it's something that is in the basis of how we interact with the past. Oh no, let me skip this. And then my own definitions of empathy and its importance to historians' responsibility is that basically that empathy is a kind of sensitivity or sensibility, or both. I mean, sensitivity in the sense of something that we perceive with our senses, and sensibility as the ability to make sense, right? So I think empathy is both of these, or is related to both of these notions. And then it enables us to intentionally engage with others from the past and the present, and acknowledge our situateness, our responsibility, and responsiveness in those relations. So I already said that empathy can be a method, for example, of producing responsible and responsive knowledge. And the aim of empathy is being constantly open, self-reflective, and willing to respond to historical injustices. So I think sometimes historians are discussing the criticism of empathy, not only historians, but people who are criticizing empathy. They don't actually understand that empathy is not something that is just given, but something that is constructed as a kind of practice. And then it should be self-reflective and open to the difference, to the distance. However, this is not about a forced reconciliation or harmonizing narrative about the past or about the future. Instead, empathy, as I understand, coexists with conflict. It's not something that is harmonizing or like final peace or something like that leads to the final peace. So empathy involves both what Jose Medina calls epistemic friction, and is also a possibility to act in moments of urgency, in the kairos, that Valdez Ramalho is addressing in his research. And then going to my conclusions on empathy as an ethical imperative, I understand with Gabriel Spiegel that empathy, what at stake here is not only the discussion of the epistemological discussion about truth or the authenticity of the past, as Bernard have been discussing, but an ethical response to the catastrophes and enduring justice of our time. And so I think that these discussions are not actually in the opposite direction of the search for evidence, the responsibility to get it right, to the validity of our narratives, or it is not the opposite of a critical approach to knowledge. Actually, I think it's part of this, but sometimes people don't recognize that empathy is playing a role. They just prefer to avoid it or think that empathy is just something soft that is not part of this kind of endeavor. So I think that empathy works very well with critical approach to knowledge, at least in this idea of intentional empathy that I'm trying to address. But I think that to discuss empathy as an ethical imperative is very complex because it requires thinking about empathy as a kind of normative approach to the past. So how can we actually systematize empathy or reconceptualize empathy in the way that can be like a toolbox for historians and theorists of history? I think this is the main problem. Dominique Lacapre, for example, does not agree that empathy can be this kind of toolbox. He said that empathy is very difficult to control because it's related to our subjective relations with the past as well. And Magnus Englander and Susie Pejarello, they are discussing how the role of empathy in the understanding and engagement is very important for the development of professional ethics of historians. So he understands that empathy is in the very base of ethics, but at the same time, empathy cannot be an ethical imperative because it cannot provide a set of guidelines, principles, or norms that can actually prevent any unethical action. So I think this is controversial about it. And then I think that a reconceptualization of empathy as an intentional practice should be further developed in historiography and theory and philosophy of history that could actually guide historians towards these responsibilities for the past and future injustice, or at least try to bring the discussions in a more reasonable way, not just avoiding the discussion, but bring the discussion and actually trying to find like if empathy still plays a role in these ethics and epistemologies of history, or if empathy should be like not included on these discussions. So yeah, so basically this was my presentation, and I have many things to say, but I think I will finish here. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, I think we begin with in the room, and I'll set up the online again, so maybe we can exchange
Sure.
place again, and then so first here, if anybody has questions, comments, concerns. You want? Please, only Matista.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. An excellent talk and topic. And I think it raises many historical questions in the sense of history and philosophy of history, and also philosophical questions as such. I have a couple of points, but I begin with this one only, and I'm urging you to be a bit more basically a bit more argumentative. So if I rephrase your point, would it be something like understanding the past well, or understanding the past and good writing of history requires always empathy, an empathetic approach. So is it always necessary to use empathy? Or is it only in some cases that you need to use empathy or be empathetic? And the first one was a claim, and then the follow-up questions. The third one is, are there cases when it should not be used, or are there limitations? But basic question, is it always, is the mandatory, is that just proposing that any historian, in order to understand past well, and therefore write good history at the end of that with the empathetic approach?
Should I answer first, or should I? Okay. Very good question. I've been engaged in the first question for a long time now, and I still don't have like a full answer for this. But I think that if we understand empathy as something that is like crucial for any kind of historical narrative, we have to precise actually how historians who actually don't think they're empathizing, or they actually avoid any kind of personal engagement or any feelings of responsibility, how it takes place in these cases. Because it's very easy to talk about empathy. It's very important when people are discussing traumatic events, like some events that actually we have like real people, like that they are addressing the experience of these people. But how to understand these empathic relations when we are talking about this idea of the past as something that is dead, and you actually don't have access to the experience, the emotions of people of the past. So it's very difficult to address empathy in this way, even though there are many people who are discussing empathy in the sense of aesthetics, how we empathize with texts, for example, is also a discussion. But for now, I think that I'm more into thinking that empathy is a kind of a special relation with the past. That of course doesn't mean that historians as people they are not empathizing, because as people we all have this cognitive capacity of empathizing, but we can control our empathy. It's possible to control our empathy, as for example a doctor controls her or his empathy when he or she is dealing with the patient. So empathy is not always good. Empathy is can also be problematic if someone has too much empathy.
Why would it be problematic?
How is problematic? Too much empathy, for example, can cause personal distress, according to some psychologists. Because if I'm empathizing with someone's experience, and this experience is so, so intense that if I try to empathize and this brings me to my own experience as well, and sometimes we can face this kind of dilemma that we don't actually want to engage with the other's feelings, the other people's feelings. We feel so much distressed about their own situation, about the other's experience, that we don't actually want to involve. So we get a bit numb or paralyzed towards these experiences. So it can cause this kind of too much empathy. But then coming back, I think that empathy, although is crucial to all of our relations with people, in historical writing, I think that empathy must be acknowledged as a kind of special mode of responsibility and engagement of certain kinds of historians, theorists, and philosophers towards certain kinds of histories.
Can I have one follow-up?
Quickly, yes.
Yes. What would be the sort of the cognitive maxim? So what are we trying to achieve with empathy? Is it because I thought it would be I must feel empathetic. I must try to empathize in order to understand the person, the real feelings and actions and position. But is that? But are you saying something a bit different? You talk about responsibility, but responsibility in what sense?
Yeah, I think that the must is the problem. I mean, we must be responsible. And I think that the ethical responsibility is something else, I think, is related to the ethical and political implication that we have in our research. And that it means to be ethical, responsible, and empathy means to be critical and self-reflective. But it does not always lead to effective political actions. That's why I'm trying to say that not all historical discourse leads to action. So that's why I understand this difference. But all of them should be responsible in the sense of being critical, self-reflective on their own engagement, situatedness, so on and so forth.
Okay, yeah. Well, we said we will alternate, but is there online any question or comment for the moment? If not, we'll go ahead with the room first. Well, you can also. Oh,
I think I have a question.
Okay, please, Eric.
Hello, thank you very much. That was super interesting. I was just wondering how to operate with the concept of empathy when we go basically beyond anthropocentrism, because empathy is kind of also basically includes the awareness of other people's emotional experiences. But when we basically go away from people, when we go towards animals or then towards like beyond mammals, let's say, like the further away it goes from something we recognize as ourselves. And even if we go to the kind of non-living, like how much is compassion then a useful tool where we not kind of continue to project imagined emotional experiences?
Okay, if I understood correctly, your question is about how we can discuss empathy in this framework that I'm discussing today, beyond anthropocentrism. How can we include animals or other non-human beings in this consideration for morality and ethics. Is something related to this, or just
Yes, like how far can you reach with your concept, basically?
okay? In the paper that I wrote about trans-species empathy, just to give a summarize, I was working with the definitions, how animal historians, I was analyzing the works of animal historians that write narratives about the lives, the experience of animals, like individual animals, but also group of animals. And in these discussions, I was also in dialogue with many other fields like ethology, neuroscience, like fields of animal behavior, and then and also animal ethics, animal studies, and then many of the texts that I was discussing, they were elaborated of how animals empathize. And empathy is a kind of ability that is not something that is inherently to humans, not just a capacity for human beings as we thought it was in the moral philosophy of the 18th century. The very idea of sympathy was the first translation of the German term Einfühlung to English, and then they retranslated to empathy. And in this discussion, sympathy, or what we call nowadays empathy, was in the very own base of humanity, something that we share with others, and that's why we can understand the experience and re-experience the concept of Naherleben or Nachfühlen, the experience of the others. But I think in the case of animals, at least in the recent research about animals, the first dimension of empathy that appears in animals is the emotional aspect, the sensitive and emotional aspect, how they perceive the emotions of the others and respond to these emotions. It's something that is very like intuitive, emotionally and socially constructed in animals' societies. And then animals also have like selective empathy, so they can empathize more with their own kind than own species than with other species. But there are some cases of like, for example, dolphins, that they can empathize more with other species as well. And then I think this is the main dimension addressed in animal behavior. But there are also some animals who have like some kind of cognitive empathy and also morality. So there are many recent research about how animals are also moral agents and also have some kind of cognitive behavior. They also can have this kind of perspective taking, which is also a term used in psychology. But then this discussion that I bring in today about how historians should be responsible and empathy as this mode of responsibility, I think this address, of course, to non-humans as well, or to the environment. I think it's we should be responsible to the climate change, for example. Of course, these responsibilities should be distributive. How can I say this? Redistributive. Yeah. But I also think that it's a bit tricky to in this kind of interactions, we have this assumption that animals are empathizing the same way as humans. So in this kind of interactions, if we bring our anthropocentric view of empathy and try to apply this to animal realm, it can be actually a way of anthropomorphizing Then, on the other hand, anthropomorphism can be dangerous in the narrative that we are writing about non-human beings. On the other way, anthropomorphism is also a possibility. Is how we engage with others, is also our own situateness, is our perspective. Even though the anthropos should be situated, it's not just the anthropos in an abstract sense, but anthropos who has like a gender, has like age or race, and so on and so forth. But I think that this notion of anthropomorphism can also be helpful in some sense to understand and engage with other non-human lives. Sorry, I think I maybe talk too much. I don't know if I answer you.
Well, we have, no, we have got a few more, so
Okay.
Thank you.
yes. Answer any length that you want, but we got a few more to get through. So, okay, we have first Roger, then Katja online, then Kathy, then online again, and then Barish. That's what we have on this so far, Roger.
Yeah, thank you, Taynna, for a really fascinating talk. Also, thank you to Eric for not asking the question that I'm about to ask, because I think it's quite related to his own work. Yeah, I had wondered for a long time why anthropologists don't really write that much about empathy. It seems to be a sort of foregone conclusion that anthropology is an empathetic subject, but it's sort of never really kind of written about explicitly. And your talk kind of gave me some ideas maybe about why. But the question I have for you is about generations, and specifically the difference between past and future generations with respect to the ethics of responsibility. So thinking beyond, say, the discipline of history and the role of historians as agents in history, and more the role of citizens as agents in future histories. So thinking about a kind of ethical responsibility to everything that comes after us. How does your works alluded a little bit to sort of futures, but spoke mostly about the past and ethical responsibilities of representing the past, or telling stories about people in the past. What about the generational gap at a deep temporal level, sort of in the other direction? So what does your work say about the ethical responsibilities to people with whom we, kind of in our sort of blood or inheritance, sort of have no kind of connection right now, but people to say 50 or 100 generations into the future, whose presence we're writing the foundational kind of conditions for at the moment. So how does this sort of function in the other direction of a temporal scale?
In the future direction.
Yeah.
Okay. Should
Yeah,
I want to say something?
yes.
The question of generations is a very interesting question. Of course, I'm not talking here of generations like this kind of period of 20, 30 years that, because I don't actually think it makes sense to talk about generations as something that is very homogeneous, because it's also very geographically located. So it's very controversial to think about a whole generation of people all over the world that have the same kind of mentality and behavior and so on and so forth, even though, of course, there is this discussion of globalization that also try to homogenize our relations. But I think that the question that you address about the responsibility towards the future, like the remote future, it interests me a lot. And it's also part of this discussion of intergenerational justice when addressing like climate change, the end of the human, or the end of the planet, and so on and so forth. One of the questions that they address is like, should people in the present have duties in relation to people that may or may not exist? Is the existence of these people in the future something that is our responsibility. And then many of these philosophers, they claim that we don't have actually a responsibility to the existence. Because the existence is a causality, but it's also a contingency. So we cannot be responsible to the existence of people. If not, people will, if you cannot, I mean, I think I'm clear about it, but we cannot be responsible to the size of the population or people who will exist or not. But we can be responsible to the ways of living of these people in the future, regardless of the amount of people, right? So we can be responsible to the ways of subsistence, that they have like enough for living, like for food and a planet and so on and so forth. I mean, so I think this is I would say that is my short answer.
Okay, thanks.
Great, yes. Next we got online, Katja. She wrote in the chat, so I suppose I'll read it out. Thank you for an interesting presentation. Would like to ask if you could once again explain how you perceive ethics. Do you see empathy as a personal ability or as an innate human characteristic which needs to be addressed when doing research?
How I perceive ethics,
Yes.
and if I see as a personal ability or innate. I don't know the difference between personal ability and innate human characteristic.
Or maybe it's acquired ability that would differentiate to innate.
Okay. Yeah. Now I understood. Okay. Yeah. I see empathy as something, of course, if you're talking about this biological predisposition that we, as human beings and some other animals, not all of them, but some of them empathize. We are talking about natural biological predisposition, but in the same way, we're not talking about the same kind of empathy. Yeah. So I think that empathy, as I have been addressing in this presentation, I don't know if it was clear enough, but it's a practice. So it's something that can be taught, it can be learned. It's not just something natural. So I think I would say like this, and ethics is a set of values that we carry that we can also be educated about. So I think empathy is also this kind of value or virtue. Yep.
Also the question, how you perceived ethics. I guess it's about your concept of ethics. What is ethics?
Yeah, I mean, I defined this in one of the PowerPoint presentations. So I was very short in my definition of ethics. I'm not actually, I'm not a philosopher of ethics, so I don't actually have my own definition, like super complex definition. I just understand ethics as something that is related to a relationality with the world, how we interact with others, the values that we carry in these relations. So, I mean, it can be many things. And also is very cultural constructed. So for some people can be ethical to be honest, or, I mean, not to lie, to be very sincere and honest about everything. But for other people can be ethical to have compassion and maybe say some lies just to not make other people feel bad. So I think ethics can vary across spaces. But when I'm talking about historiography, I'm talking about more or less a consensus. I mean, a field that needs to have a consensus, a kind of discipline. So I'm not talking about ethics in general, but a specific kind of ethics.
Next is Kari.
Yeah, thank you. Because I'm interested in environmental ethics, so I have very many questions, but maybe I take only one. It was interesting that you made a difference between intuitive empathy and intentional empathy. I myself sympathize this distinction, and especially this intentional empathy sounds ethically very well-grounded position if you think about different examples from history study or environmental ethics. For example, if you have intuitive empathy towards Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin as a historian, you, for example, pity Hitler. He seems to be a big loser if you only think without knowledge of his actions broadly. So in that case, you could say that empathy is wrong if you only think Hitler is empathetic or sympathetic person.
Mhm.
So you must have knowledge about what all Hitler has done in history. So is this intentional empathy, this kind of combination of emotional relationship to Hitler and reasonable knowledge what Hitler has done. So you can in a way correct your first intuitive empathy towards Hitler and say that his empathy was wrong in a sense, for example, Stoic or Neo-Stoic theory of emotions. Like you mentioned Nussbaum, who I think sees also that emotions are blind in a way without reason. Similar examples there are in environmental ethics, but maybe this is simple example.
Yeah, but I would love to hear.
Hitler case.
I would love to hear if you want to
Talk about Hitler.
ask about environmental ethics as well.
Okay, if you want, so.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, another-
I don't know if you have
another
time, but
example.
Or there are a few other questions. Maybe we can do it afterwards so we can get back to it if there's
Yeah.
time, but there are a few others.
okay.
So
Oh, maybe we can talk later if you prefer. It's not a problem.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
maybe for the question asked.
Yeah, sure. Bashir is also want to ask, I think. And then, okay, I understood what you're asking about empathizing with Hitler is or any other fascist figures, like empathizing with Bolsonaro in Brazil, for example.
Many do.
If you ask me if I do empathize with Bolsonaro, I would say no, don't. I mean, I cannot actually answer this. But if you're talking about this difference between intuitive and intentional empathy that I'm addressing, these two kinds of empathy, the first one, intuitive, is more moral, is more related to morality. So if one can empathize with Hitler, of course, it's a possibility in this kind of intuitive empathy. Yeah, but it's also other question to ask if this ethical or not. Yeah, and the kind of intentional empathy, I would say that in the intentional empathy, it's impossible to empathize with Hitler. So this is a kind of is when I think that ethics and epistemology are going to opposite directions in this case, because there are many authors who claim that it's possible to empathize with perpetrators in the sense that we can acknowledge the reasons behind their actions, something only cognitive. But in the ethical instance, is it impossible to empathize if you want to be ethical responsible to this? Dominic Lacapra also discussed these ideas of how empathy relates to epistemology and ethics, and sometimes it's convergent, sometimes not. So I think this kind of intentional empathy that I'm addressing is very much related to ethics, and I don't think that fascism has a place in ethics.
Yes, then we have online again now, then there's Spanish. So I think he wanted me to read out, there was Tomasz, I think.
Well, he's my friend from
Yeah, he
the
said, thanks for the presentation,
Wow.
Taynna. I have some thoughts regarding your perspective, and I think these are, yes, there are two questions, okay? How would you justify developing the concept of empathy right now? One can say the older concepts like dialogue or imagination could work here very well. Does the idea of empathy cover something not included in dialogue or imagination? Or maybe one can say your empathy project is just a new version of the philosophy of dialogue by Martin Buber or Emmanuel Levinas. One question. The second question is, when you were talking about responsibility and responsiveness, I thought about the concept of ideological state apparatuses by Louis Althusser. Its main feature is a mechanism of interpellation. Interpellation creates a sense of responsibility towards social group, institution, and so on in the given subject. That's exactly what you're talking about. Don't you think that behind the ethical imperative, as you said, of empathy, there could be a hidden ideological apparatus?
Good question. Thank you, Tomek, for this huge question.
I can leave it open for you.
Okay. Wow. I was not expecting this question at all. You could ask me this question before. Okay. I do think that empathy is very much related to other concepts. And I together with Carsten Stilber, I understand that there are many related concepts in this huge empathy phenomena. Carsten Stilber actually calls empathy-related phenomena, because it embraces not only the concept of empathy, but other concepts like sympathy, compassion. And I will also add like concepts like resonance, solidarity, tenderness, yeah, and maybe coexistence, conviviality. But in relation to this concept of dialogue and imagination, I think that dialogue, first of all, is very vague. And I mean, dialogue, I think, is a kind of just dialogue, is a neutral concept. And I don't think empathy is neutral. Yeah, I think empathy has an intention. Yeah, so has a goal. It's not just empathy as an end in itself, but empathy in order to do something, or better understanding past, or better practicing history. And dialogue, I don't actually see in this way, but maybe I'm wrong. So maybe we can discuss this later. And imagination is also a very huge concept. I cannot actually discuss this concept in the few minutes that we have. But empathy is also related to imagination for many people. But there are also some limits in this kind of imaginations. For example, how I can imagine how a white person can imagine herself or himself in the place of how a white person can perceive themselves in the place of a black person, something like that. If we don't have like the experience of this kind of experience, we don't actually can imagine how it is to be like. I mean, we don't have access to the experience per se, but we have access to the information about the experience. So, I mean, it is a very huge discussion. I don't actually want to enter into this now, but thank you for your question. And the other question about responsibility and responsiveness, about the concept of ideological apparatus of Althusser. I think I will skip this question too,
Okay.
because I think it's too much work
Yeah, but
to address this. I don't have all the
that's your
tools for
that's
this.
your prerogative as the speaker to address whatever you want in whichever way you want. Okay, next is Paris.
After all, I can ask. Thank you for your presentation. I have one criticism and just one vital question. It's your presentation caused some association of ideas in my mind circulating around some concepts, but first and foremost, I think there is one crucial point with respect to all discussion. So the backbone of your research is the concept of empathy, right?
Mhm.
And it's an ethical concept, right? But all discussion keeps going as if by presupposing some ready-made concept of ethic. So my question is, doesn't this research entail determining ethics itself? What sort of ethics be involved in? Deontological or some kind of virtue ethics or consequential ethics? So what sort of ethics be involved in? Shouldn't we at least have definition or a sufficient concept of ethics, first of all? Because as I said, all discussion as if keeps going as if by presupposing ready-made concept of ethics. So and philosophically, it doesn't come to me philosophically sound. That's why I'm questioning. So, yeah, all in all, just one question. Doesn't this research entail determining ethics first?
Yeah, sure. I agree with you, Barish. I think that the main idea of ethics, or the main field of ethics that I'm using for this, is the virtue ethics. However, I'm not fully agree with the concept of virtue, but I understand that empathy is a kind of trait that can be taught and learned, as I said, is more related to this kind of ethical practice or value, or even virtue. It depends on how you understand virtue. If it's something more related to a kind of privileged position, that's something that only few people have, or virtue in the sense that something that can be acquired somehow. But I understand that empathy is about the personal engagement, the personal responsibilities of the historian who is writing or making sense of the past. So in this sense, I think it's more related to virtue ethics, but I'm not actually saying that it cannot be related to consequentialist or ontological ethics as well. But it's my main approach, I'd say.
Okay. So you include some, let's say, preliminary ethical discussions into your research.
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah. I'm relating. Sorry, maybe I should have mentioned this in the beginning. Yeah, but I related intergenerational justice to this kind of virtue ethics approach. So, that's why. Mm-hmm.
Did you have a second part? Oh, that was the question.
No,
Okay.
that's all.
Okay, that's all.
Thank you.
Okay, I put myself also on the list, and Yoni Matti wanted to go again too. But there was a first online again. There was a follow-up question before by Erich again. To follow up what you said during your discussion with Roger, I guess the question is, our action in the present enable certain futures and disable others. So there's a connection from the present to the distant future. How should we consider this in respect to your answer? I guess the question is, how do we factor in distant futures nevertheless? I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
How we what?
How we factor in distant futures still into.
Yeah.
Maybe also in respect, sorry that I chime in now.
Yes.
To my question.
Yes.
Maybe also in respect to discussions which have been coming up with long-termism or with effective altruism. Basically, the question maybe is also
Is that altruism?
like effective altruism.
Okay.
And the question maybe is also could be maybe re-asked in a way of how can we balance basically the present with the future. Maybe that is a better formulation here.
How can do what to the present? Benefit?
How balance?
Balance.
Balance. Yeah.
Can you come back to the?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think empathy is about enabling. I mean, this is a kind of intentional empathy, as I said, what I said, is about taking into consideration some kind of possible future. Even though I don't like to address the future in a kind of messianic or utopian way, but more like Margaret says that we have to address the negative concepts, like the negatives first. It's not about bringing this well-being, but about resisting and fighting like injustices or something like that. I think this is my ideal of empathy. So I think empathy can, yes, can enable some kind of possible futures and not others. But I think that is also very idealistic in this sense. How we connect present and distant futures. Maybe we cannot connect. I mean, maybe like Zoltan Shimon claims that there is some kind of unprecedented change that actually with our resources in the present, we cannot actually make sense of this kind of futures. So I don't actually know if we need to have a connection between them. We always have like this horizon of expectation, but it doesn't actually mean that there's something connected. I mean, maybe it is. Maybe.
No, I was not asking about the connection. I was basically saying there is a connection. Like you were mentioning climate change already before. And climate change is something which is playing out actually at the time and for people which we will never know, and we will not be part of that anymore. Though we are basically now creating this situation. That is maybe a case for such a situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's
the connection is already there. This is.
Yeah, like the connection, I mean, to give the means to the future subsistence of the future generations, right? But the future generations that we don't have like the face, we don't actually know if they will exist or not. But it's just a kind of idea of the possible future generations that may exist. So in this sense, okay, you say that we are trying to connect with the future people. Yeah.
No. I'm saying that, sorry, if this is so, if the formulation is so bad. What I mean is because we are altering the future because of climate change, or like the conditions, the livable conditions, the livability of the future through climate change, for example, there is already a connection. Even if we don't know these people, we are already through the alteration of the planet, basically making this connection from the present to the future. So the question is basically here in terms of empathy, if we that we leave worse conditions for future generations than we've than we live them now, or than we have them now. So this is where I was basically saying that we maybe enable certain futures, but we also disable certain futures
Yeah.
with climate change.
Okay, yeah, I understand that. In the discussion about intergenerational justice and related to climate change, they are actually discussing this, like how, for example, saving or like consuming less to have like only enough to our subsistence. I mean, just enough for our lives without having like what's the Marxist concept of this?
Alienation.
No, alienation, no. The extra
Surplus.
the surplus, yeah, the surplus. That if we don't have this idea of we don't have surplus, we are actually having just enough of the planet that we need, and then we can like give more possibilities that the future will also have this. The future generations will also have this in the future. But it's a very difficult ethical discussion. Even if we, I don't want to be misunderstood, but even with don't want, I mean, if we only have enough that we need for survive, it also doesn't mean that the future generation will exist, because there are some contingencies, something that are beyond our agencies. So there, of course, there are some kind of causalities, like some kind of effects of our actions, but also there's also always some space for contingency.
Okay, I think I'll cut it off now, if okay, Erich, because there are a few more questions we have.
If you have more questions,
Thank you.
an email and we can discuss more, or maybe I can send you my paper. I would love to.
Yes. Okay, then I put myself on now for once, if okay. And then Yoni might have, and maybe some other people still have. I have a question again about, if I understood you correctly, you said empathy is also a method in historiography, or you also want to conceive it as a method. And of course, one thinker that immediately comes to mind, and even though the Collingwood scholar says it's not empathy, or it's not, it's Collingwood, but like reenactment. So maybe empathy leads to reenactment. It makes us understand what previous actors thought. Therefore, it's a method. I'm sure we can call it a method then, but maybe it's just a goal or something. But I have a bit of an interest if we think about what is the use of empathy in historiography. I have a few things in mind. You once said cognitive empathy. That sounds a bit like understanding. That sounds a bit like maybe what Collingwood wanted to achieve by whichever means. Usually, I would say by inference for the evidence, not by some kind of spooky connection with former generations and their heads and feeling thoughts, maybe. Another thing would be maybe empathy is a skill, maybe it's, or an emotion, or maybe an emotional skill, or maybe it's all of that, because we need to have the sort of biophysical hardware so as for us to understand it. And then it seems like you connected empathy also to a few aims, instead of next to being a method, or to a few consequences. So one of them obviously is knowledge. So if you go the Collingwoodian route, you go the epistemic route, then via empathy, we create knowledge of the past, which is great, because a lot of historians like that. And I think it's good, yeah. But it also seems like as if empathy was closely connected to political and moral goals as well, or maybe it entails them. So it seems like you connect empathy very closely to sort of the remedying of historical injustice, or that sort of stuff. But is that sort of intrinsically connected to empathy as a method? Because to me, this sounds a bit like you're taking here like something like a meta-ethical position, or just ethical positions. You take the position that you would like to remedy historical injustice, whatever that exactly means. Therefore, you hitch empathy very close to them, but it's not intrinsic to historiography. Historians don't have to remedy historical injustice to be historians, right? And or maybe they have, but then I don't know how the connection goes. And then this relates to more generally, just to say historians have political, ethical implications and imperatives, right? Right, implications might be something that is just there, they are implied in that. But if they're imperatives as well, then again you have a certain ethical position underpinning that, right, which makes them into imperatives. So I guess the second question is just, it's one question about how is the politics implied? And because I have nothing against, or let's put it this way, I have nothing against politics in historiography, but I would like it then to make the politics as explicit as possible. And that's a very controversial point, have them as detached from the epistemic goal as possible as well. So there's the epistemic part first, do that right, then build your politics on top of that if you need to as a historian. But the main goal of the historian is to get knowledge of the past, which is epistemic, not political. Should be kept free from political as much as possible. Okay, it's good like that. But okay.
Okay. Do you have more questions?
No, that's it. So it was too long, but answer however you like and whichever part you want to fit, but yes.
Great. Okay. Wow. First of all, this question about methods or reenactment or Hollywood. Tyson Retz explored this in his book and also in another article. Tyson Retz says that reenactment is not empathy, something different of empathy. And he's also more interested in the concept of historical empathy, which is a concept for history education, and how we can teach people to be more empathetic towards the actors from the past, to understand their context, basically. So Tyson Retz is more into this idea that empathy requires a contextualization. It's not just something emotional, but something very cognitive based. And then you said, so my understanding of method, I put method in the slide just to be controversial, but I'm not claiming to that empathy can be a method like objective, rational, or this kind of method. But maybe it's also a form of going beyond this notion of method and bringing methods in a different way, like reconceptualizing what is a method. Or I mean, I need to further develop this. But what you said about empathy is a cognitive empathy, understanding others, or empathy as emotional skill, something that one is different from the other and they actually do not relate necessarily, is what you do to say.
No, I was asking what the notion of empathy is. It could be all of them together.
Oh yeah, all of them together, yeah. Because Thomas Kohut, in his book, for example, he says that there are 3 dimensions of empathy. One is cognitive empathy, the second one is emotional or affective empathy, and the third dimension is a pro-social behavior, something that is related to affective actions or helping behavior, so on and so forth. And he says that in historiography, the 2 first dimensions take place, but not necessarily the last one, different from other fields. So I understand empathy as both cognitive and emotional, but I disagree a little bit with Thomas Kohut, because I think that empathy can also take place in this ethics, not only in the sense of the motivation of historians, but also in the agency of historians while writing narratives or while making sense of the past. So I think there is an agency implied, even though this kind of agency does not actually needs to be developed as an effective political action, but it's a kind of agency. So I think historians are not just knowing, understand the past and just doing some epistemic thing without having some guidance, like some orientation of, I mean, what they are doing. So I think that in this sense, I don't think you ask about if empathy is only about knowledge of the past. or is some kind of way of remedying the historical injustice. Empathy, of course, is how we get knowledge from the past. I think this is very well discussed in the bibliography. But in my presentation, I'm bringing this notion of intergenerational justice because I'm trying to make this discussion to explore how far empathy goes in the questions about historical injustice. I'm not saying that for sure empathy needs to address injustice, as effective actions. But I think many people are actually doing this. They are willing to do this. So it's something that is happening. It's not something that I'm defending. It's something that is going on that we have to reflect on this and understand the possibilities and the limits of historians as agents. So there is this difference between political imperatives and implications. Implications, we all have implications when we are writing texts, narratives about the past. So these ethical implications, they cannot be excluded of any epistemological attempt. There is no epistemology without ethical implications. So I think this is the first thing. But the idea of ethical or political imperative is something about a kind of a strategy that historians may have. They can systematize it like as a kind of guidance for historians who want to apply empathy. Really, I mean, like use empathy. How can we approach empathy in our own research? We can talk about an ethical imperative of empathy, or you also can understand that ethical imperative maybe goes too far because it's so normative, but we can use empathy in other ways as a value or something, but we need to reconceptualize what empathy actually means in historiography, because how the discussion is going now is empathy is a concept that is too loose, too imprecise. We actually don't have any concepts about it. So I think we have to discuss more about what empathy means, recognizing, of course, the limits of empathy in historiography, but the limits of empathy is not an avoidance of empathy. If we recognize the limits of empathy, we can actually know what are the many possibilities that he has for historical knowledge. Mm-hmm.
A very fitting ending word, but we're not at the end yet because we only have. It was very good actually, but I think we need soon to draw to a close. Last round.
So we skip it. I can discuss later.
Well, no, as you wish. No, as you wish. I mean, it's up to you.
Do you want to?
Fine.
No, you
Final
can ask
question.
it. Yeah, sure.
Also for online, if you have.
It's a sort of
Now is the chance to put a
broad
question.
point.
Per point.
Broad point.
Uh-huh.
Well, basically, maybe a bit summing up what Kari said, Paris said, or maybe even Georg said. And I think my basic idea is that the relation of empathy and ethics needs some work. The relation has to be maybe defined in yet more precise terms. And it was helpful what you said about virtue ethics. Now it gives us a bit of a handle to what we might be talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
And now I made a side point, and I come back to this point. The side point is that sometimes I feel a bit uneasy about some discussions where people talk about issues like justice and ethics and intergenerational justice and morality and so on. Not because I don't like them, but let's take ahead of a lot of white discussion. There's a lot of formal questions, what I would formal questions in justice and morality, and of course they're concepts, but if you just give them like that, they're without any content. They're positively connotated things, of course, but there are lots of theories of justice. It's not just there's one way to be just, or there's one theory of justice. It's a lot of depends. So if you talk about intergenerational justice, you talk about what we consider to be just. And of course, they can lift out the different theories. And the same goes with any concepts of morality. And there are theories of ethics, that normally theories of ethics. And there was utilitarian, what was it, utilitarianism was mentioned already. So that gives a little bit handle as well, but of course it could be something else and so on and so forth. And when sometimes you, but White and others, they talk about this, then I don't know what kind of morality there is, what kind of politics there is. Clearly there is something, but it's not spelled out. I can only guess, do some guesswork, like White engages probably some sort of liberalism, some liberal theory of society and liberal theory of justice or something like that. And a lot of us would probably might agree with that, but it's not clear. And certainly it would be wrong to present it as some common shared universal. Because of course you can be a fascist and you can make a fascist theory of ethics as well. It's entirely possible. You can do that. Then we can debate, is that a good theory, is that a bad theory?
Gentile did it.
Gentile did it. And those issues matter, and I think in that sense they need a little bit more philosophical sharpness. Not that you, but in general in this discussion that it doesn't get too much porridge like it. And and I think it would be sort of an interesting idea of what you said, a lot of interesting thoughts about empathy. I like the idea of it being a method. That could be a fairly straightforward suggestion. Like a methodological prescription that should be done, and I can sort of on some level understand it. But then if you put it as a worthy ethical maxim, and what Kari, then we come to the issues what Kari was talking about that. I mean, I sort of cognitive epistemologically, we could think that to be empathetic is a precondition to understand someone. So I try to understand someone's position, and I think we can go beyond going to maybe 19th century German theorists, even Rankes and others who tried to put themselves in the boots of the people in the past. But then, indeed, if it's epistemologically preconditioned, some might say that it's indeed ethically questionable, or is it? But definitely it's not ethical. I mean, his case was Hitler. I mean, I can understand psychological Hitler and, you know, his problems, his childhood, and you know, he had a society to run and what he had to do. So I can be empathetic to him. But is there, it doesn't, the point is that if it's a virtue ethic, I'll always empathize. Is there a tension in some ethical mode? For example, it's too much empathy. Does it lead to excusing? I guess that's the next one. Do I excuse Hitler's violence? Okay, this is a long debate that takes another time. But the relation is not automatically clear. And then the final is, if that would be virtuous to be empathetic, and even such that methodologically we should use it, of course, it gets to an interesting issues about limitations. I mean, you just mentioned, and there's a lot of course, discussion about this as could I write the history of Black people properly? Or am I part of my situation and monologating the situations not to be able to be empathetic in the right sort of sense, because I could not maybe, well, that's a question, could I situate myself in their books, you know, in order to write proper history? And those kind of cognitive limitations, okay, some people say that's too much of a limitation, because then only the participants of a group can write on history and no one else. It seems to be too much of a restriction. So I all come to these very large points about these concepts of relations, empathy, ethics, and then justice, and then yeah, that's just a comment. It's not even a question, but this is a comment. But
Yeah, thank you for your comment, and I read with you that I have to be more precise, more specific about the definitions of just morality and ethics, and how this relates to empathy. Of course, I understand, for example, that justice is not a concept that is like good or positive. I don't have this. I don't have this idea that justice is a kind of set of the system of norms is something that is good. I mean, it's normative, of course, but justice in this sense can also be the opposite of empathetic relation, or even can also be not fair. So, for example, when we are talking about empathy with victims in a persecution, for example, if we empathize too much with the victims, we can be too harsh on the judgment of the perpetrator. Yeah, depending on the crime, of course, I'm just giving an example, ideal example. And if we empathize with the perpetrator, we also re-victimize the victim. You also, discussions about rape, for example. If we just say, but she was dressing like short clothes, that's why she was raped, something like that. And then there are these discussions about justice, for example, in how empathy can stand in the way of justice as this kind of normative system. But there also how justice may not be enough. For example, in cases of reconciliation and peace, in this transitional justice, as Benaj has been discussing, maybe doing justice is not enough. That's why historians are also agents. They also can do justice, but not justice as the field of or the set of norms, but as a way of transmitting somehow the memories and the silences in the past, not speaking for the others, but actually bringing the lack of voices into historical writing. So I think this is also very important. For me, this is about doing justice. And I will not address all the questions, but I also want to say, just to conclude, that, for example, write a proper history of Black people. This is something that you discussed, and also is something very controversial, and many people may not agree with my understanding of this. But we have like a philosopher in Brazilian philosopher, who has this definition of how can I translate it to English? It's lugar de fala in Portuguese, but it means like speech place. Like situateness is, I think, it's a similar concept for situateness, that we have our own position in relation to our place, to our times, in our time, and then it's not a barrier to speak. I mean, to write history about other people they are distant from us. Actually, we are doing this all the time from people from the past. I mean, I don't need to be in the past to write history about the past. And I think the same applies to the history of black people, of like queer people. I don't know, but I think that we have to acknowledge the cognitive limitation in these histories we are writing, the epistemic gaps. But of course, it's just a limitation. Limitation is not a barrier. I mean, it's just a limit. Okay. I mean, it's a possibility. Limit is also a possibility. And then we have to be aware of our situateness. Is something about our ethical implications. Yeah, so I would finish with that.
Yes, I think this is a good finishing word, unless really there's a really eagerness. Okay, then thank you everyone very much, online and offline, for this event. Especially thank you to you, Taynna, once more for giving this talk and for this long discussion and being so engaged. And we'll see each other again on the 28th of May with Seth Doan on Between Marx and Gramsci, and everything else is on our social media and on our homepage. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.